Good morning once again. Let's continue with our series of lectures. Today, we turn to session 3 that discusses the basic elements of research. Session 1 presented a brief overview of research. In this session, we move a step further to discuss 4 basic elements of research, which are theory, concepts, variables, and hypothesis. To be able to conduct and understand empirical research, it is important that you understand these basic terms. When you have completed this session, I expect you to do the following: to be able to define and explain what concepts are, to be able to discuss the different types of variables, to be able to discuss the role of hypothesis in research, to be able to discuss the relationship amongst theory, concept, and propositions, and also to discuss the relationship amongst these terms. The key topics we are going to cover are concepts, theory, variables, and hypothesis. These are the prescribed textbook. Please take your time to read the relevant chapters of these texts. Let's begin with topic 1, concepts. What are concepts? We are surrounded by concepts every day, but for our purposes, let me quote a definition from Sarantakos. According to Sarantakos, concepts are words that label, they name, they classify, or they define objects, experiences, events, or phenomena, or relationships. Concepts are simply words that label, they name, they classify or define objects, experiences, events, phenomena, or relationships. A concept can be an idea, it can be a word, or it can be a shorthand to represent a statement. To be able to understand what concepts are, let us see a few examples. The word man, age, income, height, weight, gender, and the phrase level of education are all examples of concepts. This is why I said we are surrounded by concepts every day. Words like leadership, honesty, competence, productivity, motivation, authority, bureaucracy, self-esteem, all these are concepts we encounter every day. A concept can be concrete or it can be abstract. An example of a concrete concept is income, weight, height, and age. An abstract concept could be adolescent, youth, authority, power, etc., etc. Now, we will note that concepts are the building blocks of theory. Now, let me go back to concrete concepts. These do not need definitions to be understood. Concrete concepts do not need to be defined for us to understand what they are or what they mean. If I mention the word income, you know what it is. If I mention the word weight, you understand it, and you can also conceptualize height and then age. Now, where we need a definition to define a concept, then we say that concept is abstract. Now, when you talk about the word adolescent, adolescent may mean different things to different people in different jurisdictions. In the West, for instance, the adolescent age is from 10 to 18. In other parts of the world, adolescent could be described as the ages 10 to 21. So you see, in different jurisdictions, we have different meaning for adolescent. So if you are conducting a piece of research, you need to be able to define your concept in such that they will be understood by those you are writing for. So as I said, a concrete concept does not need a definition to be understood. Concepts are abstract when the meaning of an idea or a term differs depending on the context in which it is used. These words are meaningful when they are defined in ways people understand them. Let's take the word authority as another example. Authority is better understood when it is defined in a power relationship. In the military, for instance, a major is higher than a lieutenant in rank. Consider also the word adolescent, which I have already discussed. Theory. What is theory? Again, let me quote a definition from Cohen and Mannion. They say, a theory is a set of interrelated concepts, definitions, and propositions that present a systematic view of phenomena by specifying relationships amongst variables with the purpose of explaining and predicting the phenomena. Concepts, definitions, and propositions that presents a systematic view of phenomena by specifying relationships among variables with the purpose of explaining and predicting the phenomena. Now, a theory simply is a systematic attempt to explain something like this. For instance, why do people commit crime? And why do people get married? Why do kids play truant at school? All these questions could be answered by theory. Take note that the key element in the definition of a theory is a proposition. A proposition is simply a statement concerned with the logical relationship among concepts. What we are trying to say is that propositions represent relationships amongst concepts. So for there to be proposition, there must be concepts. Let us use this example to illustrate. Consider the statement, an expansion in a bar of metal occurs when it is heated. Now, this is a proposition which contains concepts. What are these concepts? These concepts are heat, atoms, metals, expansion, etc. Now, how are these concepts related? How are these concepts related? The first point, metals are made up of atoms. The structure of an atom is changed by heat, and heat causes atoms to expand. If the statement were to be theory, this is how we will explain it. We try to explain the relationship amongst or between the concepts found in the proposition. Now, so theory explains the relationship among these concepts in the proposition. So we say a theory is a set of propositions. Propositions are made of concepts. Therefore, without concepts, we don't have a theory. Hence, concepts are the building blocks of theories. Let's now turn our attention to variables. What are variables? Let us define and explain variables. A variable is simply a concept that varies. If you have a concept that takes on more than one value, then that concept is a variable. On your left-hand side on the screen, you find some words. These are concepts. Gender is a concept. Income is a concept. Educational attainment is a concept. All those words that you find on your left-hand side are all concepts. Now, how do they become variables? They become variables because they take on more than one value. Now, if we consider the word gender, gender takes on two values, male and female. We can also consider income, which is a concept, as a variable because we can have high income, middle income, and low income. Here, we say that income has taken on 3 values. Let us look at temperature. Temperature is a concept, but because it takes on more than one value, it becomes a variable. The values are hot or cold, religion, Christianity, or Islam, height, tall, or short. Even political affiliation is a concept, and it is at the same time a variable because it takes on different values. People can belong to different political parties. I hope you understand the meaning of variable by this illustration. We go a step further by classifying variables by the nature of variation. Classifying variables by the nature of variation. Now, according to this classification, there are 2 main types of variables. We have categorical variables and quantitative or continuous variables. Under the classification of nature of variation, we have categorical and quantitative variables. When the variable or variables are associated with specific categories, we refer to them as categorical variables. So, a variable is categorical if it can be classified into distinct categories according to some characteristics, attributes, or property. Now, the variations represent different kinds of categories. We shall come to look at a few examples soon. Such variables do not fall along any continuum of measurement, and the variation is simply identify a property as having 2 or more distinct categories. Here are a few examples for illustration. Gender. Gender takes on 2 values, which are male and female. And we are saying that gender is an example of a categorical variable because we have male and female. The values of gender are male and female. We could group males to one side and females to another side. These are the categories. So here we say gender is a categorical variables. The variables are the values are the categories. Let's take another example, eye color. People have blue, brown, or sometimes you can even have an eye color that is green. Now, these are the categories of eye color. So we say eye color is a categorical variable. In terms of age, one can be young or old. So young and old are the categories of age. Now, the attributes for a categorical variable should be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Pay attention to these 2 words. All the attributes of categorical variables should be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. We say that categories are mutually exclusive if an element or individual fits into one and only one attribute of the variable. Categories are mutually exclusive if an element or individual fits into one and only one attribute of the variable. Now, I will illustrate this with an example later. Categories are exhaustive if all the elements fit into one of the attributes of the variable. That is, each element must fit into one category. For instance, separating males from females. By all means, each and every individual should fit into one category. We should not have anyone who says, I am not a male or a female. If there is such a situation, then we say that the categories are not exhaustive. For instance, if you have a group of people in this room and we can classify them along religious lines to be Christians, Muslims, or Buddhists. If every individual in the room belonged to any of these, and there is no one belonging to any other group, then it means we have exhausted our categories. That is exhaustive. Let us move a step forward by classifying variables by the nature of the variation. Now, under the nature of variation, we have first identified what categorical variables are. The second categorization is quantitative or continuous variables. We say variables are continuous or quantitative if they can be measured in the numerical sense. If we can measure the variable in the numerical sense, it means that variable is a quantitative or continuous variable. What do we mean by this? The values can be divided into fractions. The values can take on infinite number of values. They can take on values within certain range, and in some cases, the values can be divided into fractions. If we say the values can be divided into fractions, what do we mean? We can have a variable like height, and somebody can measure 6 feet 1 inch. So we can divide height into fractions. Now we also said the values can be divided, the values can take on infinite number of values. If we have a number of people in this classroom with different ages, somebody can be 21, 19, 15, all along, so we don't know where the final limit is. So values can take on infinite number of values. And then they can take on values within a certain range. For instance, the income of people in this institution can range from certain number of Ghana cedis to a certain amount of Ghana cedis. So here we have a range. We have a range. You can take the income of bankers from the lowest paid to the highest paid constitutes a range. In some cases, the values cannot be divided into fractions. The values cannot be divided into fractions. For instance, you cannot divide the score in a football match into fractions. Simply, 1 goal is 1 goal, or 2 goals are 2 goals. You cannot score 1.5 goals. Okay, so as I said, the first example, the values can be divided into fractions. You have height. Let's take the height of level 300 research methods class. You can have 6 feet 1 inch, 5 feet 8 inches, and all that. And then can take on infinite number of values, ages of students 21, 19, 18, and all that. The income of bankers, you have between 4,000 and 900 Ghana cedis per month. And as I said, in some cases, you cannot divide the values into fractions. For example, the scores of a football match. Let's move a step forward. We are now going to classify variables by the functions they perform in research. We are classifying variables by the functions they perform in research. And according to this classification, for our purposes, we shall look at 3 of them. These are dependent variable, independent variable, and extraneous variable. Dependent, independent, and extraneous variables. There could be others, but as I said, for our purposes, we are looking at only these 3. Let us first consider the independent variable. What is it? The independent variable, as the name implies, exists on its own. It depends on nothing to change it. So we call this the presumed causal variable in a relationship. No variable causes this variable to change. This variable, which we call independent, rather causes other variables to change. So when we manipulate or we vary the independent variable, we assume that it can cause a change in other variables. So here we say the independent variable is the cause variable because it causes a change to occur in the dependent variable. As you live, you are dependent on your parents, so you are not independent. Your parents are independent on you. Now, having looked at the independent, what is the dependent variable? The variable that the independent variable is presumed to affect is called the dependent variable. It is also known as the outcome variable. What we are saying here is that the independent variable has the capacity to change the status of the dependent variable. In other words, the nature of the dependent variable depends upon what the independent variable does to it, how it affects it. Let us use a few examples to illustrate this point. Now, an experiment seeks to examine the relationship between sunlight and the growth of plants. An experiment seeks to examine the relationship between sunlight and the growth of plants. Can you identify the dependent and independent variables in this experiment? As we have said, the independent variable exists on its own. It doesn't need anything to change it. Variation of this independent variable rather causes a change in the dependent variable. So going by this explanation, the independent variable in this example is sunlight. Sunlight exists on its own, and the dependent variable is the growth of plants. What we are saying here is that the growth of plants, that is, for plants to grow well, they need some amount of sunlight. So here, the growth of plants is the dependent variable, and sunlight is the independent variable. Let us take another example. Students of different ages were given a jigsaw puzzle to put together. They were timed to see how long it took to finish the puzzle. Again, identify the variables in this investigation. What was the independent variable? The ages of the students. Different ages were tested by the scientists. What was the dependent variable? The time it took to put the puzzle together. The time was observed and measured by the scientist. So that explains the distinction between independent and dependent variables. Now, in any graphical representation of independent and the dependent variables, or in any statistical analysis, a variable is identified by the symbol X for the independent variable and the symbol Y for the dependent variable. Now let us look at some labels associated with the dependent and independent variables. Now the independent variable is also known as the presumed cause or the stimulus. We also call it predicted from, antecedent, manipulated, or is a predictor. Because as we have said, you need to manipulate the independent variable to see its effect on the dependent variable. So the dependent variable also have other names which are presumed effect, response, predicted to, consequence, measured outcome, or criterion. Now, we are still classifying variables according to the functions they perform in research. And the next one we look at is extraneous variables. These are nuisance variables. They are not desirable because we are not interested in them. Yet, they have the tendency to affect the relationship between the dependent and the independent variable. In other words, they influence the outcome of a study, though they are not the variables of interest to the researcher. So what we need to do is to identify these variables and control them. It is only by controlling these nuisance variables that we can establish the true relationship between the dependent and the independent variables. Let us look at one example. The relationship between background music and task performance amongst employees at a parking facility. We are looking at this hypothesis. There is a relationship between background music and task performance amongst employees at a parking facility. This is a hypothesis we want to investigate. So can you identify the independent variable? Let us go ahead and do that. The independent variable in this example is background music, whilst the dependent variable is task performance. Now, in trying to establish the relationship between these variables, are there not any other variables that are likely to affect this relationship? These are the nuisance variables that we just talked about. So in this kind of relationship, let us consider some of the variables that we can call nuisance. So extraneous variables that can affect the independent and dependent variables are: one, type of background music. That is it a rap music, dance music, easy listening, classical music, etc. We are saying that this can affect productivity because, or task performance, because if you played a rap music and the workers are above a certain age, they may not enjoy it. If the workforce is in their youthful category and they prefer rap music, then you are likely to say, or we can confidently say, that background music is affecting or can affect the relationship between the dependent and independent variables. Also, another extraneous variable that can affect the two variables are the loudness of the background music. Also, the time of the day can also affect the background music that is played. So sometimes the extraneous variables can also affect the dependent variable. Take note that they can affect both the dependent and independent variable. The examples we just saw was how they can affect the independent variables. But in this case, employee tiredness, employee motivation, and job satisfaction are some of the nuisance variables that can affect the relationship between the dependent and independent variables under this investigation. Having looked at variables, let us now move on to look at what hypotheses are. What is a hypothesis? As usual, let me begin with a definition given by Newman. According to Newman, it is a proposition to be tested, or a tentative statement of a relationship between two variables. A proposition to be tested, or a tentative statement of a relationship between two variables. It is a testable proposition, and it is one in which the relationship underlying the concepts are operationally defined. Let's take a look at a few hypotheses. 1. GCB workers have more than average level of job satisfaction. GCB workers have more than average level of job satisfaction. This hypothesis contains only one variable. Number 2 is associated with their level of efficiency. The level of job satisfaction of GCB workers is associated with their level of efficiency. Number 3, the level of job satisfaction of GCB workers is positively associated with their level of efficiency. The level of job satisfaction of GCB workers is positively associated with their level of efficiency. And then the last one, the higher the level of job satisfaction of GCB workers, the lower their level of absenteeism. All these are examples of hypotheses. Now let's consider some types of hypotheses. The first one we shall look at is descriptive hypothesis. Descriptive hypothesis contains only one variable. That is, in other words, it's a univariate hypothesis. And descriptive hypothesis typically states the existence, size, form, or distribution of a variable. We go back to the example we just explored. Officers in my organization have higher than average level of job satisfaction. This hypothesis has only one variable, which is level of job satisfaction. So we say it is a univariate hypothesis. It only shows the distribution of the level of commitment among the officers of the organization, which is higher than average. So such a hypothesis is an example of a descriptive hypothesis. Relational hypothesis. Relational hypothesis describe a relationship between two variables. The relationship could be non-directional, it could be directional, that is, it could be positive or negative, it could be causal or simply correlational. What we are saying here is that a relational hypothesis has some characteristics. One, it can either be positive or negative. That is, variables can either be positively related or negatively related. That is, the hypothesis point to a certain direction. Let us look at these examples. Non-directional hypothesis is the one in which the direction of the association has not been specified. It is one in which the direction of the association has not been specified. That is, the relationship may be very strong, but whether it is positive or negative has not been postulated. Example, level of job satisfaction of GCB workers is associated with their level of efficiency. The level of job satisfaction of GCB workers is associated with their level of efficiency. You could see here that there is an association between the two variables. It doesn't show whether the variables are positively related or negatively related. Correlational hypothesis. Correlational hypothesis states merely that the variables occur together in some specified manner without implying that one causes the other. So, taking the examples we just saw, the level of job satisfaction among GCB workers is positively associated with their level of efficiency. We are saying that there's a positive association, but we are not implying here that one causes the other. The higher the level of job satisfaction of GCB workers, the lower their level of absenteeism. Now here, we do not make any claim that one variable causes the other to change. That will be possible only if we have control on all other factors that could influence our dependent variable. We move on to explanatory hypothesis. Explanatory hypothesis. This implies that the existence of or a change in one variable causes or leads to a change in the other variable. Explanatory hypothesis implies that a change in one variable causes a change in another variable. This brings us to the notion of dependent and independent variable again. Let's consider again the example between sunlight and plant growth, and then also lung cancer and smoking. Here we are saying that lung cancer is caused by smoking, and then sunlight causes plants to grow. Yeah, in explaining the relationship, we say that sunlight causes plants to grow. So here there is a causal effect between the two variables. Sunlight causes plants to grow. And then the second example says that lung cancer is caused by smoking. What we are saying here is that assuming there are nuisance variables, are we able to control them in order to establish the true relationship between the two variables? If we are able to do that, then we can categorically say with a high level of confidence that sunlight causes plants to grow and then lung cancer is caused by smoking. Hypothesis plays an important role in research. Let's briefly look at some of these. It serves as a guide and directs the conduct of the study. Without hypothesis, then what are you studying? In the absence of any formal hypothesis, you have research questions. So whether you go by research questions or you formulate hypothesis in order to guide the conduct of the study. Again, hypothesis identifies the facts that are relevant and those that are not. That is, we are looking for the relevant concepts within the hypothesis. These are what we are going to test. Now, it suggests which form of research design is likely to be the most appropriate. When you have formulated your hypothesis can dictate the kind of research design you need to adopt. We shall come to look at research design subsequently. And then hypothesis provides a framework for organizing the conclusions of your findings. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this session. In this session, we considered some basic but essential terms of research. These are concepts, variables, hypothesis, and theory. We noted the relationship among these terms and the role they play in research. As I have always advised, read your handouts on this lecture alongside the prescribed textbooks, and then try your hands on the sample questions I have provided. Thank you.